Well, welcome everyone to another In the Spirit of Things conversation. And today I have with me Eyal Press from New York, who has written a book called Dirty Work. Now, we've been talking quite a lot of late. You've probably seen some of our other conversations about moral injury. And when I saw this book, I thought I've got to talk to this person and I've got to have an in-depth conversation. Having read it, oh my goodness, what a lot to explore. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here and glad to be talking about my book.
Thank you. So first of all, where did this idea come from? Because it's such a big story.
So I think when people see the title of the book, Dirty Work, they're going to probably be thinking this is a book about people who collect garbage on the streets and get themselves sort of physically dirty. But as you know from having read it, it's a book about moral dirtiness. It's a book in which I look at people whose jobs require them to do things that are morally troubling, but crucially, things that society has sort of tacitly condoned and even depends on. And so it's the relationship between these kinds of hidden, morally treacherous jobs and the way our lives are structured that interested me. And it is a book about the United States, but I think that the dynamic I look at is a universal one.
Absolutely. So did you know anything about moral injury before you started researching this book?
So I knew a little bit about it, but not much. What I discovered, there's a section of the book, as you know, that is about the people in the US military who carry out drone strikes. This is sort of stereotypically seen as this kind of video game warfare. They're sometimes referred to as joystick warriors. And the idea behind that is, well, they feel nothing. They just sort of do this and then go home and don't think about it. But as I was researching this, I discovered that within the military, they've found that the levels of stress and distress are enormously high within this program. And that's when I started looking into moral injury, because the soldiers in that program, they never set foot on the battlefield. They don't expose themselves to the kind of events that traditionally cause PTSD, these kind of near-death experiences. So what is it that troubles them? And then I came across this idea of moral injury, which is bearing witness to, or participating in acts that go against your own core values, and then having to really live with that. And the entire book deals with moral injury in different iterations, because it's not just the military.
No, and I found Harriet's story, which I hope you'll talk to a little bit about, quite disturbing, because she was trained in mental health, or was training in that area, but the impact on her life was quite profound. And the lack of voice and the way she was silenced and living with her own conscience was very difficult.
Yeah, so Harriet, who you referred to, Harriet Kryskovsky, is the first character in the book, and she's a mental health aide. In the United States, if you work as a mental health aide, you're just as likely to work in a jail or a prison as in a hospital, because America's largest mental health institutions at this point are jails and prisons. They are not hospitals. And that tells you something about the criminalization of mental illness, and it tells you something about the criminalization of poverty in this country. And so Harriet gets this job in the mental health ward of a prison, and she quickly discovers that many of the men in that ward are being really abused and mistreated. And at first it's little things like they're not being allowed into the rec yard to get sunlight on time, or they're not being allowed to do exercises she wants to give them. But then she learns it's more dramatic, and she discovers a horrific form of abuse that some of the guards were carrying out, where they were locking these prisoners in a shower, a scalding shower, where the water flow and the temperature was controlled from the outside. And there's a prisoner at that prison, Darren Rainey is his name, and he dies in this shower. And Harriet shows up at work hearing this. She learns of what happens from a nurse at the prison. And she says, well, surely they're going to get in trouble, these guards. And the nurses say to her, no, they're not going to get in trouble. They're going to cover it up. And indeed, that's what happens. And she then faces the moral quandary. Should I report this? Should I sort of expose what the guards have done? Now, listeners to this are going to say, well, of course she should. This was a horrific abuse. Why wouldn't a person who's a mental health aide expose this? Well, what you learn when you read the book is that Harriet and all the mental health aides in the prison were beholden to the guards for their own protection, for their own security, right? She was going about her job and security gates had to open, and the guards are the people who open them. She can't be left alone, and indeed she started to be left alone with groups of prisoners when the guards started suspecting that she wasn't on their side. And so that pressure and that fear leads to a self-silencing, both for Harriet and the rest of the staff. Now, we talked about moral injury and how that manifests. When I first met Harriet, she was wearing a wig. She wasn't, I could see that it was a wig, and I wasn't sure why she was wearing a wig. As I got to know her, I discovered that the experience of working in this prison caused her hair to fall out. This is how distressing it was for her to, in a sense, feel like, she knew these things were going on and she wasn't saying anything. She lost her appetite. She fell into a depression. She was subsequently diagnosed by a psychiatrist with PTSD, but it's really moral injury that is the most striking theme in her story and in the other stories I tell in the book. And it raises a question, I think, about, responsibility, because it's easy to sit here and blame a person like Harriet and blame the other mental health staffers that I interviewed. Why didn't you expose this? Why didn't you come forward? But there's a broader circle of responsibility, which has to do with a society that has turned jails and prisons into de facto mental health asylums, and usually doesn't ask too much about what's going on behind the walls. So that's kind of the theme of that section of the book.
So why did you, you've got three major case studies that you talk about, and then you touch on dirty tech, when I sort of feel as though I would have liked that to have gone on further.
Yeah.
And then COVID, but I guess the book has to begin and end somewhere. What made you choose the three case studies, the three areas of dirty work that you looked at? Because you talk about the slaughterhouses as well.
Yes, so I looked, as you say, I looked at prisons, jails and prisons, and the mental health wards in particular. I looked at the drone program, the sort of virtual wars that America has been fighting. And I looked at industrial slaughterhouses in the United States, particularly in poultry, which is America's most popular meat. I chose those areas because, the book is, as I say, premised on the idea that this dirty work, while hidden from view, is quite central to the way Americans have come to live their lives. And so let's look at the prison system. The prison system in America is not something that most Americans sort of interact with on a daily basis, unless you're yourself in the criminal justice system or you have a family member. It's very easy to not see it, to ignore it. But it is the largest prison system in the world. It is larger than China's. It is larger than Russia's. And this prison system was built over decades by forces that coalesced in the 70s and 80s and 90s to produce this kind of punitive ideology, this kind of, lock them up and throw away the keys idea. And America went with that. Both parties, I should say. It's not just Republicans, it's not just Democrats. Both parties went along with this until it suddenly dawned on us, 5 or 10 years ago, that we had created mass incarceration, this system that the rest of the world looks at and thinks, wow, how can you imprison? It's over 2 million Americans behind bars and jails and prisons. And as I said, it's not just a criminal justice issue. It's also become a de facto mental health system. because what happens is jails and prisons warehouse a lot of poor Americans who have mental health issues but do not have the ability to, afford treatment for those services. So that's one. But in each case in the book, I'm looking at something that is not so incidental to the American way of life right now. And let's shift that from away from the prisons to the slaughterhouses, these poultry slaughterhouses that I look at. Again, if you don't, most Americans never see them. They're located in kind of poor, remote areas of the country. Don't feel any connection to them, and yet America is a country where fast food and cheap poultry, beef, and chicken, are central to both not just the diet, but a lifestyle, a real sort of way of eating. And it's eating meat that is produced under socially invisible conditions. And I look at the immigrant workers who work in those slaughterhouses. And again, I think we see moral and emotional burdens that they bear because of the work they do and the conditions of the work. And then there's the drone wars. And the drone wars, again, are, since September 11th, 2001, America has been fighting this kind of geographically unlimited, boundless war, whereby America bombs places and carries out lethal strikes. And there's very little accountability. There's even very little sense of where it's happening. I think much of it is secret. And so, but there too, I think America made a choice to kind of continue these wars on the sly, out of sight and out of mind. So we were willing to say, well, let's shut down the black site prisons and Guantanamo and so forth, but the drone wars go on. And so I chose these areas because I think they say a lot about what, as Americans, we've become willing to countenance and really to have done in our name.
So did you find it hard to get into these places? Because, speaking to some of the people you were able to get access to, it was gobsmacking.
Very hard. So I worked on this book, for 5 years.
Did you? Okay.
And one of the main reasons it took that long is that you can't just waltz into a prison and say, "Hey, I'd like to talk to the mental health staff. Can I have an interview?" You will have an even harder time knocking on the doors of a slaughterhouse and saying, "I'd like to take a look inside. Would you mind showing me the kill floors, the places where the animals are sort of hacked apart and so forth?" And actually, I did have a heart. I couldn't get into the poultry slaughterhouse I was trying to enter. And so how do you report on the work conditions in these worlds if you can't get in? And if you can get in through what I call the front door, right? If you do call and speak to the press officer, they let you in. Well, occasionally they will give you a tour or something like that. But what you'll get is 45 minutes of very vetted imagery. You'll walk through the halls and you'll be shown all the good things that are happening. But what you won't get is the backstory, is the story that happens when a visitor is not there, right? And so to tell that story, I felt I had to find people who work inside these places and get their in-depth stories, learn everything possible about their lives and experiences, and try to honor their lives and experiences. Now, the characters in the book, as you know from reading it, are caught up doing things that dirty their hands, right? They are not saintly figures. They are not people who can sleep easily at night based on what they see and do in the workplace. But I don't set out to write the book in order to condemn them for this. I want to understand the larger system that has shaped the conditions of their work. And I see them as both participants in these systems and victims of these systems. I don't think that that someone like Harriet Krzyzewski set out to harm the men in that mental health ward, but she felt understandably reluctant to stick her neck out when it came down
Absolutely,
to,
absolutely.
and I think when people read the book, I would like readers to ask themselves, how differently would I have acted than her, in this situation?
And it's really interesting because the backstory of each of the characters is essential to understand how complicated human lives are, against a bigger system against them. And putting, food on the table becomes important to keep your job. And you tell that with Harriet's story particularly well, because she came from a family, I think if I remember correctly, of violence, and, they'd struggled, and she was just getting her life together with her husband. So it wasn't easy to speak up. She had to think about the other ramifications.
Absolutely. And you bring in a really important point. So this is a book about social class and
Mm.
inequality as much as it is about moral injury. And I think those two things are connected. Um, I'm sure a lot of people listening are familiar with, the old caste system in India, where you had literal castes of people who were considered pure if they were at the top of that system, and they wouldn't touch things like leather goods, which are considered, very sullying in India. And who would touch those things? Well, the Dalit, the people who became colloquially known as the untouchables, dirty people who do dirty work, who touch dirty things. Now, America does not have a formal caste system, but I think that in a very similar way, the dirty work in the United States ends up being delegated and allotted to people at the bottom of the social pyramid, people with the fewest choices and opportunities, who get sort of assigned these jobs and in effect are kind of America's untouchables. They become people who work these stigmatized jobs, they bear moral injury, and yet when we really pull back, we have to see how the rest of society is actually implicated in what they're doing.
Which is a really good segue to the very beginning of the book, when you talk about dirty work and the essay that was written all the way back in 1948. Is that correct? Like,
Yes.
I was gobsmacked that was written, that, people looking and not wanting to know. Can you just tell us a little bit how you found that essay and where that came from?
Sure. So the essay you're referring to is called "Good People and Dirty Work," and it was written in 1948.
Oh,
It was only published in 1962. It began as a kind of a speech that Everett Hughes, the sociologist, gave. But what Hughes did is he had spent a semester in Frankfurt, Germany, right after World War II. And he had been in Germany before the war. He had gotten to know some people. And who does a professor of sociology from Chicago get to know? He gets to know what he calls the good people, the cosmopolitan intellectuals, the educated social class. And when he goes back in 1947, 48, he wants to hear from them about what transpired during the war, the Nazi era. What are these good people going to say to him? And he's at the home of an architect one night having tea. And one of the guests says to him, because learning he's American, the American soldiers here behave very rudely. Germany was still under, that part of Germany was still under US occupation. So Hughes says, well, what do you make of the comportment of German soldiers during the war? And the architect who's hosting says, what you would expect him to say. We're ashamed when anyone brings this up. Of course, it was awful what the Nazis did to the Jews and so forth. And then the architect says, but the Jews, they really were a problem. He proceeds to say that they were taking all the good jobs, they gathered in these filthy ghettos. He says all of these things that, while not quite saying, well, what the Nazis did were right, makes it very clear that he saw Jews as an other, as an outside group, as something that needed a problem that needed to be taken care of. And Hughes extrapolates from this bit of conversation, which he keeps hearing this on the one hand, on the other hand,
mhm.
that what the perpetrators of the Nazi genocide undertook was dirty work. And what he means by that is it was not the project of rogue actors doing this thing that no one would have approved. It was rather the Nazis took care of the Jewish problem for people like the architect, who of course didn't support the Nazis, but also didn't ask too many questions about what was going on. And the most fascinating thing about the essay is that Hughes has addressed the essay not to Germans, but to his fellow North Americans, because he says, you know, these dynamics, we may think this is only a problem in Germany, but actually there are forms of dirty work in every society. And we need to think about whether these forms of these activities have what he called an unconscious mandate from society, from the good people. That's the starting point of the book. And I take the questions that Hughes raised and try to revisit them.
It was profound because we have so many instances where we have, you know, uncovering corruption and all sorts of terrible things. And people say, why didn't somebody speak up? And we often talk about the bystander effect, that people need to speak up. But you've really hit the nail on the head that people tacitly know, but somebody else is doing the task. Therefore, let's just get on with life and pretend it doesn't exist. It was extraordinary.
And think about the examples I gave and how easy it is to just kind of get on with life and not ask any questions. The drone program in America, whatever you make of it, to me, the most striking thing about it is that nobody's talking about it. It's kind of out of sight, out of mind. There was a recent drone strike in Afghanistan that did make a lot of news in the United States. A family, including many children, were killed in that strike. But by and large, those strikes don't appear in the headlines. Nobody talks about them. You know, during the course of writing this book, 2 presidential elections took place, and I kept waiting for one question to be asked about whether the drone lethal strikes should be scaled back. Is it right? What would we think if other countries did it? Never came up, not in a single presidential debate or primary debate. And that tells you how out of sight and out of mind it is. Likewise with the prisons, likewise with the slaughterhouses.
So just touching on healing, because moral injury is not a diagnosable mental illness at this point. Whether or not it needs to be is another issue. That's up to the mental health professionals. But there isn't any, I guess, agreed treatment. There is some acknowledgement of communal gatherings and acknowledgement. You talk about that a little bit.
So yes, I think that the, you know, it's tricky with moral injury because it's not a medical diagnosis.
No.
It's really about an injury to the soul. It's about, you know,
being human,
a sense of being human and being profoundly disoriented. And I would venture, I think one of the things I love about the idea is that we are all morally injured in one way or another. There's really no way to get through life without sustaining some form of moral injury. And there's a wonderful quote on the back cover of my book from the writer Rebecca Solnit, who says, you know, that the workers in the book, you know, bear these moral injuries, but they belong to all of us. And if there is a form of healing or reckoning with moral injury, I think that where it would begin is with some kind of public acknowledgement, because so often what ends up happening is there's an individual who's dealing with this sense that, you know, I've done or seen something wrong, and I, like Harriet, right? And I haven't said anything, and she bears this burden alone. But I attended a ceremony, a very powerful ceremony. It was the Veterans Administration in Philadelphia has been doing fascinating and innovative work on healing from moral injury. And what they do is they take these veterans who have experienced moral injury and they bring them together, and first the veterans talk among themselves and have this kind of group therapy for weeks. I don't know exactly how long it lasts, but they really go through a process of coming forward to each other to talk about things they saw in war. Then there is a public ceremony, and they invite members of the community to listen to their stories, to hear about what they did and what they did in the name of the country that sent them to fight these wars. And so I describe in the book one particularly dramatic ceremony that I witnessed, where a young man named Andy, a veteran, who began by talking about how he grew up in a very violent home, and he wanted to protect the innocent. He wanted to protect the weak. And after 9/11, to him, protecting the innocent, protecting the weak, felt like protecting the folks who had been attacked and victimized, his fellow citizens. So he enlists in the military, and he goes to Iraq, and he is in a battle one day, and he calls in an airstrike on what he thinks is an enemy, a building full of enemy combatants. And when the smoke clears, he sees that it's full of civilians. And he tells this story in front of this public audience, and he's sobbing. This guy is, just broken down. And what's so powerful about the ceremony is that after he speaks, the minister who was there called everyone in the audience forward and asked them to circle Andy and the other soldiers who had talked, and to say in unison, and I'm not going to remember the exact words, they're in the book, but basically the effect of the message is, we sent you to this war, and we share responsibility for what you witnessed, what you did, what you didn't do. And it was this striking counterpoint to the kind of private experience that people like Harriet have had. And I think it points to a direction of healing that we could go in if there was more dialogue about these things.
Yeah, and I probably will start to wrap there, because I think there's a message for anyone working in a system, whatever it might be, that has workers who are being harmed or confronted by what the daily work is to think about, how do we heal collectively? Because we cannot move forward as a society with people bearing this pain and this anguish. And it's relative to many areas of society, not just the case studies you share. So what's next after spending 5 years of your life on such a deep subject? Are you going to take the tech story, because we haven't chatted about that, dirty tech, to the next level, because that's a problem?
Well, I don't know right now quite what's next on the book front. Of course, I'm writing away in terms of articles, but I will say that the book does end with a chapter called Dirty Tech. And what I point out there is that, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, Silicon Valley was thought of as this gleaming, this place where clean work was done, right? Google, as its sort of motto, chose, make the world a better place. And for a while, nobody questioned this. It all just seemed, like a rosy story about broadening access to information. Now, of course, what we see with Facebook, with, Google, with so many of the big tech companies, is that they are just as implicated in dirty work as, a lot of other industries are. And in fact, I point in that chapter to some of the synergies. I point out, I tell the story of one Google worker who discovered that a cloud program she was working on was actually being used for the drone program in the military. And she was horrified by this. I speak to another former Google worker who talked about and discovered that a lot of tech companies are helping fossil fuel companies improve drilling technology offshore. So far from clean, this is actually fueling climate change and fossil fuel extraction. So, the book ends very much by going to the corporate suites of these companies and seeing that a lot of the same dirtiness can be found there.
So to end, did you see a solution, an obvious solution, or did you finished the book thinking, okay, it's out there, people need to start thinking about this. What was your concluding thoughts around all of this?
I don't think there's an easy solution, just as there's not an easy solution to racism, to classism, to
Yeah.
sexism, to oppression, to war. I mean, these are large problems that have been with us for a very long time, and it's not my expertise or necessarily my job to kind of solve these issues. I do think that it begins with awareness, and so as a writer and as a reporter, what I can hopefully do is shed light on these hidden corners of America. And I will say on a hopeful note, because it's important to not, I think, give people, I think hopelessness can fuel indifference and apathy very easily.
Mm.
And what I would say about the dirty work that I write about is that as much as it is central to the social order that Americans have gotten used to, it's also striking how much has changed. With mass incarceration, I mentioned the decades of policies that fueled this. But today in the United States, there's actually a bipartisan agreement that mass incarceration is a problem, that the prison system is too big, that far too many lives are wasted and resources are squandered just warehousing people in these facilities. And that's a dramatic shift that took place very slowly as people became more aware and more active. Likewise with the industrial food system, 15, 20 years ago, it was all just kind of humming along and no one was asking questions. But as a consequence of, a lot of activism and consumer awareness and books like Michael Pollan's The Omnivore's Dilemma and hopefully my book and others, there's growing awareness that that shrink-wrapped package of chicken or steak that you see in the supermarket, which looks kind of bloodless and has this label, often has a label now saying humanely treated, humanely raised. Don't buy it. There's something behind that bears looking at more closely. And so, these things can change. Dirty work is not immutable. It is subject to the collective choices we make as citizens and the values we either accept or change and question.
Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.